On Saturday, the Trump administration arrested Mahmoud Khalil at his Columbia University housing. Khalil graduated from a master's program at the school in December. He was a top negotiator with the school during the anti-Israel campaigns in the spring of 2024, and most recently helped with a sit-in at Barnard to protest expulsions over the same issue. Khalil's Saturday arrest came one day after the Trump administration announced it was canceling $400 million worth of grants and contracts with the school over Columbia's perceived failure to crack down on anti Semitism. Education Secretary Linda McMahon said this was all just a matter of the school failing to uphold, quote, all federal anti discrimination laws. Columbia, you'll remember, spiraled out of control about a year ago when, as the AP describes it, pro Palestinian demonstrators set up an encampment in April and inspired a wave of similar protests. Protesters at Columbia went on to seize a campus building, resulting in dozens of arrests when police cleared the building. You probably remember seeing videos from that at the time. The encampment was civil disobedience. The students, I should say, knew that they were violating the school's reasonable rules governing campus conduct, and that was actually the point of their protest. That's what civil disobedience is. But the university struggled to enforce those rules, despite not really struggling one bit to enforce or even to stretch those rules when, for example, the censoring of right of center speech was involved over the last decade plus. So think about this. In about 24 hours, the Trump administration started canceling hundreds of millions of dollars in grants at one school and then arrested a recent graduate in university housing with the ostensible goal of deportation. Khalil is actually under investigation from Columbia as well, which has sought to untangle the self-inflicted knot since coming under fire from donors and more, like many schools, especially Ivy Leagues, after October 7th. According to NPR, quote, the university's allegations against Khalil focused on his involvement in the Columbia University apartheid divest group. He faced sanctions for potentially helping to organize, quote, an unauthorized marching event in which participants glorified Hamas's October 7th, 2023 attack and playing, quote, a substantial role in the circulation of social media posts criticizing Zionism, among other acts of alleged discrimination. Khalil told the Associated Press, quote, I have around 13 allegations against me. Most of them are social media posts that I had nothing to do with. Now, just days before Khalil's arrest, Secretary of State Marco Rubio posted on X, quote, those who support designated terrorist organizations, including Hamas, threaten our national security. The United States has zero tolerance for foreign visitors who support terrorists. Violators of U.S. law, including international students, face visa denial or revocation and deportation. Now, this is, like I said earlier, a very naughty mess for these universities who were actually probably in violation of, as Linda McMahon says, quote, federal anti-discrimination laws in cases that relate to right of center speech or at the very least anti-left speech, and now are having those same laws that were never enforced or wielded by the political right in a way that actually threatened, again, $400 million of grants to Columbia University, just in this case, that is expected to spread across other schools. We'll see if the Trump administration uses this as a test case that scares other schools into compliance with, as they say, federal anti-discrimination laws, which I think, by the way, probably need some good balance in their enforcement. But at the same time, if we're talking about compliance with this idea, as the House of Representatives put it in a bill that passed not long ago, anti-Zionism is anti-Semitism. That is a line from a bill that was passed by the House of Representatives. That is compliance that I would say will likely put them out of compliance with federal anti-discrimination laws in some cases as it pertains to people who support Palestinians and not Hamas, but support Palestinians. So joining us now to make sense of all of this, given that hundreds of millions of dollars, billions of dollars are on the table, as are people's visas and green cards, according to Secretary Rubio, is Zaid Jilani. We're going to ask whether free speech-loving conservatives are engaged in hypocrisy, are engaged in power politics, or maybe a combination of both. Zaid Jilani is here. He writes the great newsletter American Saga over at theamericansaga.com. Make sure to subscribe. Zaid, thanks for joining us.
Yeah, it's great to be here.
So Donald Trump's Immigration and Customs Enforcement, also known as ICE, has arrested, and I'm reading from an NPR report, quote, a Palestinian activist Saturday who played a prominent role in Columbia University's protests against Israel. And NPR goes on to describe this as a significant escalation in the Trump administration's pledge to detain and deport student activists. Now, the Trump administration would maybe quibble with that language a bit and say this isn't just about student activists. This is about foreign students who are supporting terrorism, which we can talk about how the definition of that could get the Trump administration maybe on the wrong side of the broader free speech conversation. So let me just start with that. This is over Mohammed Khalil. He was a graduate student until December. He was inside a university owned apartment Saturday night. ICE comes in, they take him into custody. Is this hypocrisy from the Trump administration, which still to this day continues to talk extensively about support for free speech?
Yeah, look, I think if you view these issues as a matter of you support freedom of speech or you don't, it could look hypocritical because they have branded themselves around freedom of speech, freedom of expression. Certainly, not only Trump, but also his sort of lieutenant Elon Musk, I think, has been very active in that domain since he bought Twitter and turned it into X. But I think actually, what's driving this is probably more of a confluence of political interests, right? So the Trump administration came to be partly from the support of various, I think, constituencies and interest groups that just have a lot of reason to support efforts like this. I mean, one part of it is, one of his largest donors was Miriam Adelson, the wife of the late Sheldon Adelson, who was a casino magnate, who's always been very active in supporting, Israel efforts. They even fund a very large publication in Israel, a right wing publication in Israel, and they've been very supportive of groups in the United States that are urging the U.S. government to be in lockstep to have no daylight with Israel. And actually, the man who I believe helped write the executive order on anti-Semitism that Trump signed, actually in an interview afterwards, he kept referring to Dr. Adelson. So they weren't very subtle about this being a very kind of powerful constituency for the Republican Party, for Trump personally, that wanted to see a sort of crackdown on campus. At the same time, I think many people in the conservative universe, even just normal conservative voters who maybe don't have super strong feelings about the Middle East, they have just been antagonistic to colleges and universities, I would say, the past 6, 7, 8 years, because they believe that colleges and universities have been biased against conservatives, that they mistreated conservatives. So I think a lot of them would just say, hey, how does it feel for the shoe to be on the other foot, right? You censored us, we're censoring you. So I think if you look at it as a matter of political expediency, I don't think the Republicans would say that they're being hypocritical, right? Because they think it turnabout is fair play, right? That's the argument you tend to hear from these folks. And I don't think that the people who are particularly interested in the Israel issues themselves, I mean, for the most part, I don't think they even really say that they're free speech maximalists or that they're big believers in freedom of speech. I mean, their political cause is largely about maintaining U.S. support for the Israeli government, right? And in doing that, whether someone is prevented from speaking at a university campus, whether someone is deported if they're a foreign student. In this case, the man in question is a permanent legal resident. So I'm not even sure how this is going to play out in court. Seems very likely to be the Trump administration loses in court. But in the face of, I think, their political cause, freedom of speech is not the ultimate value, I think, that they're holding on to, right? Like, I think a lot of people have pointed to, like, Barry Weiss and her website, the Free Press, um, actually featured and published and revealed the enforcement action that the Trump administration is going to be pursuing against the University of California, claiming that they've created an anti-Semitic climate in the University of California. I think a lot of people have pointed to Barry and said, "Oh, she's being hypocritical because all these years she talked about freedom of expression." But that's only if you really thought that Barry Weiss's goal was to be the new ACLU or to be FIRE, which is this group which works largely on university campuses to prevent censorship on left and right. Fairly principled group. I don't think that was actually her goal. I think she had a political goal, which was to promote a certain policy towards Israel that's, like I said, in lockstep with no daylight, and that things like freedom of expression or immigration policy, those are secondary to her, right? I mean, she believes that the Israeli government is valid and within its rights to drop a 2,000-pound bomb on a refugee camp to try to kill one person and kill 200 other people in the process, right? So it's not something America would do, but it's something that Israel has come to do. And if she believes that's valid, I don't see why she would have a moral qualm with deporting someone for their speech, right? Like it's actually probably far less immoral in the grand scheme of things, but she believes it's necessary in order to promote a certain policy posture on Israel, right? So, I think to answer your question, it could be hypocritical if you really thought that this crowd was adamant about free speech to begin with, but I don't really think that the major political parties values free speech in and of itself, right? They will promote it and they will speak of its importance when their side is being censored. But I don't necessarily know that there are that many people who are just very adamant that even people they hate, even people they strongly disagree with, who they find offensive and just demonic, should have the right to free speech. That point of view is usually expressed by people who are like professional civil libertarians, right? Like, last there are people in the former older ACLU, some people maybe in the current ACLU, people who work at Fire, various eccentric academics who are civil liberties lawyers and constitutional lawyers. Those are the people I think of as the most adamant about freedom of speech. I don't really think of politicians as people in that mold.
And one of the, I think, variables to untangle here, and it's certainly been a problem for Colombia, is exactly even just as you were talking about how Barry would see this case, which is that universities should not be providing support or space for anti Semitism, which brings us to this question. Columbia University is a private school, so it's not a public school, but it's a private school. And the definition of anti Semitism is something that has been a political football for a really long time, just like the definition of racism or the definition of sexism. But when it comes to anti Semitism, I think even what you just said, Zed, as you know, because I'm sure this has happened to you on social media, would be lumped into a broad category of anti Semitism. And it seems that the right, which was fighting those broadened definitions, and I don't mean Republicans, because I agree with you. I think it's obvious that you treat free speech as a political football, just, as the Democrats do. But sincere ideological conservatives who fought the broadening of the definition of racism, for example, during the Black Lives Matter movement, are comfortable with a very broad definition of anti-Semitism, and that seems to me maybe at the heart of tension people are sensing between how conservatives behaved outside of government and how they're behaving now that they have the reins of government.
Yeah, I think that's fair to say because there may have been people who were watching that crowd and believed that they were sincere in their beliefs that it wasn't just a political tactic, but that it was a moral or principled stand, right? Uh, I made this point that one of the definitions of anti-Semitism that this crowd promotes, the pro-censorship crowd in this case, and I mean like organizations like the ADL or various Israel lobby organizations, the definition that they promote comes from what's called the IHRA, which is the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, and it's very association. It's very controversial because it really does use a very expansive definition of anti-Semitism that's very much tied into debates around Israel. So, like one of the statements that would be considered anti-Semitic from their documentation is that to say that Israel is like a racist endeavor, right? And it's funny because they're trying to have universities, state governments, which in some cases have adopted this definition, and the federal government adopt this definition. So what it would do is like if you're a student at, let's say, NYU, which is one of the places that's starting to adopt these new speech codes around Israel, you can say that America is a racist country, that America is a white supremacist country. Nothing will happen to you. You have not violated any speech code. But if you make a similar remark about Israel, if they adopt this definition, right, then you would be considered anti-Semitic. You'd have to be punished or sanctioned in some way, right? And so it is kind of wild for, you have a movement that describes itself as America first, that describes itself as nationalistic, that is creating speech codes around a foreign country that are more strict than speech codes about your own country, right? Like you can trash America as much as you want, and you're not going to be violating a speech code. But if you trash Israel, you do violate the speech code, right? And I think part of that is like they've turned Israel issues into like a personal culture war issues, the same way the left did it with like transgenderism or Black Lives Matter, where like you are insulting or denigrating or you're even making unsafe a minority group if you speak a certain way about a country. Now, I've never seen that standard applied to Chile or Iran, right? Like Henry Kissinger was a celebrated academic across many universities. Hillary Clinton works at Columbia University, right? It's not like a Libyan student can say, "Well, Hillary Clinton makes me feel unsafe because the war that she supported fractured my country." Right? Like you can't. You would just laugh if someone said that, but again, I don't think it's about principles. It's just about political power, right? Like the organizations that are promoting this point of view, I think they happen to be just very politically influential, and I don't think they care that much about freedom of speech. They care about winning the debate around Israel. And is it going to win them debate around Israel? I kind of doubt it. And that's for two reasons. One, the debate around Israel is actually not polarized by education. Like if you look at survey and polling data, people who didn't go to college happen to have about the same point of view, same splits as people who did go to college. It's a much bigger split around age in general, around race and religiosity. So like those three things are kind of hard to control through censorship. And it's a little bit of a red herring for people to think, okay, kids are going to college and then they come out hating Israel. That's not really what's happening. The second is that I think censorship works best when it's like total, right? So like my Twitter avatar for many years has been from the Hong Kong protests. Hong Kong protests have basically been crushed by the Chinese Communist Party because they were so comprehensive. They just arrested like anybody who came out with like a protest symbol, right? And they created a climate of fear, and there basically is no democratic movement in Hong Kong anymore, right? But the difference between that and this is that if you're taking a few examples of a few people here and there getting censored, you're not going to be able to change the minds of hundreds of millions of Americans, right? That you'd have to install a censorship regime that's so broad that it would flatly be unconstitutional. And what it might just do is just get a lot of people who are in the middle who don't care that much about the Middle East because most Americans don't. Those people in the middle do care about freedom of expression, right? And if it does feel like American politicians are demanding speech codes around a foreign country and foreign conflict, I think that'll rub a lot of people the wrong way. So I don't know if the people pushing this are ultimately serving their own cause at the end of the day, but I don't know. I talked to people at like major American Jewish organizations about this, and sometimes they just flatly tell me, like, yeah, my donors just want I try to tell my donors to be more pragmatic, but they don't want to be like, we're talking about boomers who just like are really frightened by these protests and find them very obnoxious and maybe even frightening or dangerous. And they just want them gone, right? And so like that's what they demand these organizations do. But ultimately, will it serve their cause? I kind of doubt it in the long run.
Well, and the sensitivity is understandable from the perspective of even just talking about age. Like, it's not been that long since World War II. It's within the living memory of,
Right.
of some people who are still donors or whose parents, the parents of people who are still donors experienced horrors. And so, from
Mhm.
the alternative viewpoint here, as I think about many of my friends who see this, they look at what was happening at Columbia University, and there were two separate things. There was the encampment where you had even a lot of Jewish students who were protesting the war on Gaza, and then you had in some cases it was hangers on, like at NYU, who were maybe from local Antifa groups, whatever, who were causing some genuinely yeah, I mean, some genuinely unsafe situations, and this is now when the Trump administration is pulling $400 million in federal funding. They are saying it's because all of these schools, there are others on a list that they have, quote, may have failed to protect Jewish students and faculty, according to the New York Times. And this brings us to another one of the interesting conversations about free speech on college campuses. And I remember this was, what was it, Middlebury, famous example many people remember when students rushed the stage during a Charles
Right.
Murray speech, and I believe hurt one of the administrators, sent her to the hospital. Um, there are rules on campuses, and
Yes.
sometimes they're not the same. I mean, free speech in a place where you have to keep students safe, and you are
Right.
sort of an institution that belongs to the classical liberal school of thought, which classical liberalism is itself not neutral. I don't know. I mean, I think Zed, I'm curious what you make of
Yeah.
it.
I
Go ahead.
No, it's a good point. Like, actually, when you brought up Middlebury, I thought of a funny story I know about Middlebury, which is that Middlebury actually invited. This was, I think, it was either in the '90s or early 2000s. It was before the war, so it's probably '90s. They invited like the Taliban, like wanted to speak at Middlebury,
Mm,
and they were like, "Yeah, you can come speak, but we'll also have like a feminist author on the same panel." And like they canceled, right? Like they didn't want to do it, right? But like I thought that was a funny way of like Middlebury has had like genuine free speech battles before, and like they were very open about it, right? But I think the incident that you're describing, actually, that incident was covered in a Senate hearing about free speech, and
mhm,
Elizabeth Warren made the correct point that like, look, anyone should be able to speak, but if you're causing harm to people, in that case, some students actually injured, I believe, a professor who was
mhm.
who was accompanying Charles Murray. if you're causing harm to people, it's not freedom of expression, right? Like it's conduct, it's not speech, right? And the school not only should schools be involved in sanctioning or punishing that, but it is appropriate for the government to do it, right? Like whoever is the local jurisdiction of district attorney and the police, like, they should be involved in incidents where people are being hurt. The question though is that viewpoint neutral, right? And I think
Hmm.
a lot of what's happening around this issue is they're just like, okay, first of all, they're just describing pretty much all the protests as anti-Semitic, which I don't agree with. But second, even if like they're talking about restricting anti-Semitism, they're still talking about restricting a thought or an idea, right? Which is really not super appropriate for the government to do at a certain level. Like the government can prevent actual discrimination, like if someone is not hired because of their race or their gender or their religion, that's an issue for the government to be involved. But the government isn't really supposed to be just punishing people for having a certain thought in their head, right? Or
Hmm.
like a certain idea or like an expression of that idea, right? Like that is getting a little bit more thorny. And it just doesn't seem like, in terms of the like some of the actual events that you had discussed, yes, I think there were some like extreme left people who like caused actual property damage. There were some people on the other side, on the extreme right, who
Hmm.
attacked an encampment at UCLA, some like really hardcore,
Hmm.
you know, Israeli far right type people who like literally went and beat people up at UCLA. There was a good CNN piece on this.
Hmm.
Like incidents like on either side like that should be policed, and the government does have a role to stop law breaking and harm to people, right? But the problem is, I don't think it's being expressed in a viewpoint neutral way. They're kind of pretending that like if you have a certain viewpoint about Israel, you're the problem and you need to be policed. Whereas really the idea is that the government should be facilitating freedom of speech and expression among all people, and it should only be punishing the lawbreakers, right? The people who would harm someone, who would destroy something, who would engage in vandalism. There have been a number of cases of vandalism. I think those are really the areas where they should be involved. Instead, it almost seems like they're running up against a line of trying to tell people what to believe and punishing people for not sharing those beliefs. At least that's how they're messaging a lot of it,
Hmm.
and that's really not that's less appropriate for a government to do.
Yeah, that's well said. And the
Mhm.
last thing I wanted to ask was about this. Uh, refrain that you hear from people who are supportive of crackdowns like this one from the Trump administration, who say this stems from students providing like material support for Hamas, which is an issue that
Mm,
comes up over and over again in the Israel debate because the people of Gaza have a government that is de facto Hamas. And so if you
mm,
are offering to support for the people of Gaza, oftentimes that means it goes through infrastructure. It has to go through government infrastructure in certain cases, or because the population is so intertwined with the government, it's a very small community. It's a problem. It doesn't mean that there aren't people who actually do completely, fully sympathize with Hamas. That's something
mm.
that we have seen. But on the other hand, it does create a genuine problem. And I wanted to see, because we're hearing that from the Trump administration right now, that they're just cracking down on people who are offering material support to terrorism. Uh, that's very difficult to police. It's genuinely kind of a
Mm.
tangled question. So what do you make of it, Zed?
Yeah, I mean, I think once something like that hits the court, though, it can be figured out like what somebody's actually doing, right? So like there are, I think, many channels or pathways to donate to Palestinians or to donate to Gaza that are not a matter of, your money's going to end up in the hands of Hamas militant or someone like that, right? And so the idea that students will be providing support, I don't know. I mean, I think they're kind of using those words very loosely. Um, for instance, they like the guy at Columbia who's being put through deportation proceedings. They're saying that he was in protest that align with Hamas. Like, what does that even mean? Like, align with Hamas? Like, I don't know. It seems like they're using this language very loosely to insinuate that like he was like sending them money to make bombs or something, right? Which no one actually alleges he was doing. But the insinuation is being made. That's really the only, like, legal line that you can cross is, like, if you actually go and you give, money or some other type of resource to an organization that's designated as terrorist, right? And that I don't think has really been found in any of these cases. Occasionally, there are cases like that brought forward. Like, there's people who send money to ISIS, right? And that, like, the FBI brings those cases forward, people are prosecuted. But, like, the appropriate place to litigate that out is in the court, right? To bring your evidence to court. They'll have a lawyer. Both sides will present their case. It's not really to make these kind of highly political statements that insinuate someone's doing that without proving it. Which unfortunately, a lot of what is happening here is that. The last thing I want to say is I feel like I always have to bring this up whenever we talk about campuses. Like, look, like ultimately, if we want to reduce anti-Semitism and we want to reduce like racism in general, like against Palestinians or Arabs, so on and so forth, we really have to bring these conflicts to a close, right? Like when there's a hot conflict, people who have ethnic and cultural ties to those conflicts become very, they become very emotional and they say things that I think they probably wouldn't in other circumstances. I have some Jewish conservative friends who at one point has said something like they should just drop a nuclear bomb on Gaza, which is a horrible thing to say, but like kind of understand why they're saying that when when tempers are so high and like people are so angry at each other. And so the ultimate way to bring the tempers down on all sides, to bring prejudice down on all sides, needs to be just to bring the conflict to a close. And some people might think it's incoherent that like Trump is doing this, well, at the same time, he seems like he is trying to end the conflict. Like there was news broke that he was directly negotiating with Hamas, trying to go over Netanyahu's head because it's pretty obvious Netanyahu is an obstacle here. It's not really incoherent though. If you think about it as like, Trump wants quiet on campus for his political coalition, but he also wants quiet in the Middle East for himself because he doesn't want to be sucked into that region for 4 years. He doesn't want to be dealing with all those problems. So ironically, like if Trump gets that part of the equation fixed, if he is able to win a long-term ceasefire and reconstruction, I think you'll see a dramatic decrease in the tempers, right? You'll see a dramatic, like there was a guy in Miami Beach who shot two Israelis because he thought they were Palestinian. And then one of the Israelis went on his social media and wrote death to Arabs afterwards because he thought it must have been an Arab that shot him. He couldn't have been a Jewish guy. Eh, Like, should that guy be deported? Like, look, it's just no, no, we shouldn't deport the Israelis who wrote death to Arabs either. Like, we should just try to bring tempers down. And as far as what the US government is doing, I think instead of continuing to underwrite these large conflicts all over the world, we should try to bring them to a close. Like that to me will be more effective than trying to like just beat people over the head with a stick until they say the right things. I don't think that'll ever work. So
Well, and I also think on that point, this is sort of the fig leaf is the wrong word, but this is sort of being used as a gateway drug to mass defunding of universities who are getting federal
right.
money in different ways. So this is just sort of an easy, more palatable kind of bipartisan. You'll probably be able to get like the Alyssa Slotkins of the world on board with something like this.
Yeah, and look, like this is probably where I'm most sympathetic to what conservatives have been saying because I do think that colleges and universities have been treating conservatives unfairly like the past, decade or so. And I kind of understand some of the resentments that conservatives have built up against them. But, the way to respond to that is for colleges and universities to do more to protect the free speech rights of conservatives, to promote conservative ideas and values, and like let them have a free and on equal footing airing, which I think in many cases they weren't getting an opportunity to do that at many, particularly elite colleges. Um, but I would just say to conservatives, like I think last year there were opportunistic actors like Bill Ackman who were suggesting that they were going to help conservatives by waging this crusade over Israel. They really didn't, right? All they really did was create like a version of DEI around Israel, right? And it's like, you know, that doesn't really help conservatives. Might in the short term help Israelis, even though I think it'll backfire in the long term. But the way to really help conservatives, I think, is to promote more freedom of speech, more freedom of expression, right? To make sure that people on the right are not prevented from holding meetings, from expressing their points of view, that we don't keep widening the definitions of things like racism, transphobia, anti-Semitism to where nobody can really say anything or everyone's walking on eggshells. People are going to say things that offend each other when you're talking about a controversial issue. That's natural and normal. If you just talk with your neighbor or someone about something, you're both going to offend each other at some point. But it's more about like how do you get through it? Like how do you set up good dialogue and forums and channels for people to be able to get past being offended by each other and actually like have good conversations. Like that's more what I want them to do. I think both sides, left and right, just trying to beat people up until they say the right things. I mean, I don't know. It makes political conversation about certain topics just miserable. And so I hope we are able to move past that.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. Zed Jilani, thank you so much for joining us.
You.
Thanks so much for tuning in. As you can probably tell, I have complicated feelings about all of this. I actually worked for a long time with college students. This was my first job when I graduated from college, actually at one of the schools on the Trump administration's list, reportedly, George Washington University. I worked with college students to actually allow them to have conservative speakers on campus and to do conservative activism on campus. I'm extremely familiar with the campus environment. And so that's why I'm actually particularly sort of irked by the idea that, we haven't seen this from the Trump administration's official behavior yet, but House Republicans passed a bill that said anti Zionism is anti Semitism. And people make perfectly good arguments for that case, but that's not like that's absolutely threatened speech that is not in violation of federal anti-discrimination laws. And as Zed said, I really like that he brought this up. The best thing for conservatives is to have, I say this as a conservative, really robust debates on campus, really challenging debates, and sometimes debates that are unsettling and disturbing. To allow those to happen on campuses. On the other hand, I think Ben Sass was a really good example when he was president of the University of Florida, and said basically like we're going to enforce the rules on campus. If you're in violation of those rules, you're going to be punished. And again, that's what people who are engaging in civil disobedience expect. You're going to get punished if that's part of your protest. By all means, it's part of your protest, but we have to enforce the rules on campus. So if you want to camp out, just expect that we're going to say, hey, we need to have a clean and safe environment here at the school. But say what you want within the boundaries of course, anti-discrimination law and free speech at public schools. Florida is a public school. Columbia is not. So, but it does get those federal grants, which is a huge weapon that the right has not used for years as these universities have steamrolled with their ideas, for example, of like very radical things about sex and gender. So, this is a conversation that I think is necessary right now. I'm eager to see how the right hashes it out. I'm very eager to see how the Trump administration handles it going forward. It's possible this is just meant to be a shot across the bow, or it's possible that this really continues for years to come. Thank you for tuning in. You must subscribe here to Undercurrents. You can do that at YouTube, wherever you download your podcasts, and over at undercurrents.tv. This week, our premium subscribers have the opportunity to submit questions to Senator Ron Johnson, who's doing a live stream with us on Thursday. So make sure to get that subscription now. It's just $1 for your first month. You get a weekly newsletter from me and premium episodes of the show, in addition to some other great content from Unheard. We'll be back here with more Undercurrents soon.